7 men entered the forests of southern Oregon before sunrise on October 14, 1972, expecting another routine day of timber work. By the following afternoon, all 7 were dead, their bodies scattered across miles of wilderness. There were no witnesses, no gunshots reported, and no signs of a struggle when they vanished. If you have the courage to listen to this story, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. But I warn you, this narrative contains extreme violence based on real events. Southern Oregon's timberlands were not just forests, they were labyrinths of silence. Towering fir trees blocked the sun, while thick layers of pine needles swallowed sound and erased footprints. Logging roads twisted unpredictably, many unmarked, known only to crews who had worked them for years. Once a man stepped off those roads, he could disappear within minutes, unseen and unheard. In 1972, timber was everything. Small towns lived and died by logging quotas, mill schedules, and federal permits. When land boundaries shifted or contracts changed hands, livelihoods vanished overnight. Independent crews were being pushed out by larger interests, and resentment had been building quietly for years. Arguments didn't happen in offices. They happened in bars, camps, and deep in the woods. The 7 men were part of an independent timber crew operating near a disputed section of forest close to the California border. They weren't officially cutting that day. Their task was inspection and marking, walking land that had recently changed ownership on paper, but not in practice. Several locals later claimed the crew had been warned to stay away from that area. Those warnings were ignored. They traveled in 2 pickup trucks, carrying basic gear and personal rifles common in logging country. No heavy machinery followed them into the forest. Families were told they would be back by nightfall. The men were experienced outdoorsmen, familiar with the terrain, confident enough to believe nothing could go wrong in daylight. That confidence would not save them. The first body was discovered almost by chance. A hunter, tracking deer far from any established trail, noticed boot prints leading down into a ravine. At the bottom, he found a man kneeling forward, hands bound behind his back. A single gunshot wound at the base of the skull ended his life instantly. There was no weapon nearby. Deputies initially suspected a dispute among the crew. Logging accidents were common and firearms were everywhere. But that theory collapsed when a second body was found nearly a mile away, killed in the same manner. Then a third. Each man restrained, each shot clean and precise. No signs of panic, no evidence of resistance. This was not a fight. By nightfall, search teams moved through the forest calling out names that never answered. Radios crackled through the trees, but the woods absorbed every sound. Flashlights revealed no trails of blood, no discarded equipment, and no shell casings. Whatever had happened, it had been controlled, deliberate, and fast. Someone had planned this. As state investigators arrived the next morning, rumors spread through nearby towns. Some claimed the men had crossed powerful interests. Others whispered about old timber families enforcing boundaries the law never truly controlled. A few locals refused to speak at all, insisting that asking questions in those woods only made things worse. The forest, they said, remembers everything. When the 4th body was recovered before noon, one detail changed the investigation entirely. All 7 men had been killed within a narrow area, yet none of the execution sites overlapped. That meant the victims had not been followed. They had walked into a trap already set. The discovery that the men had walked into a pre-planned kill zone shifted the investigation into dangerous territory. This was no spontaneous violence between loggers. Someone had known their route, their timing, and their purpose. That kind of intelligence didn't come from chance. It came from watching, listening, and waiting long before the first truck entered the forest. Investigators retraced the crew's movements from the previous week. They learned the men had been surveying land recently transferred to a private holding company based out of Northern California. On paper, the land was legal to inspect. On the ground, it bordered areas controlled for decades by local timber families who rejected the transfer outright. Ownership had changed. Authority had not. Several locals admitted, off the record, that outsiders had been warned away from that stretch of forest. Signs had been torn down, survey stakes pulled from the ground. Trucks had been followed before. The message was always the same. Paper deeds didn't matter here. Respect did. And respect was enforced, not negotiated. The 7 men ignored those warnings because ignoring them had always worked before. Logging disputes usually ended with threats, not bodies. But 1972 was different. Timber prices were falling, mills were closing, and desperation had replaced patience. When survival is threatened, traditions harden into rules. And rules demand punishment when broken. Ballistics confirmed all 7 men were killed with the same type of rifle ammunition, fired from multiple elevated positions. The shots were taken from angles that suggested long familiarity with the terrain. Whoever pulled the triggers knew exactly where to stand, when to fire, and how to vanish afterward without leaving a trace. This wasn't skill learned overnight. The binding marks on the victims told an even darker story. The men had not been executed where they were first stopped. They had been detained, separated, and moved. Someone had taken the time to control 7 armed men without firing a single warning shot. That level of dominance suggested numbers, planning, and absolute confidence. Fear had done most of the work. Investigators quietly questioned why none of the victims had attempted to run. The answer emerged slowly. Several men were found with hands bound using logging rope tied in industry-specific knots. Familiar knots. Knots taught on the job. Whoever restrained them spoke the same language, worked the same trade, and came from the same world. The killers were not outsiders. As the search expanded, law enforcement noticed something unusual. Certain areas of the forest were never searched thoroughly. Trails went unmarked, ravines were skipped. When asked why, deputies hesitated. Volunteers refused to enter specific zones altogether. No one explained it openly, but everyone understood. Those places belonged to someone else. By the 5th day, officials faced an unspoken dilemma. Arrests would require witnesses. Witnesses would require cooperation. And cooperation would tear the community apart. In towns built on mutual dependence, breaking that bond could destroy livelihoods faster than any murder investigation ever could. Justice had a cost no one wanted to pay. Behind closed doors, the case began to cool. Leads were documented but not pursued. Names were written down and quietly set aside. Search efforts slowed. Press briefings grew vague. The narrative shifted from execution to unknown assailants, then to insufficient evidence. The truth was being buried while the bodies were still warm. The families of the 7 men noticed the change immediately. Calls went unanswered. Updates stopped coming. Questions were met with silence or polite deflection. Grief turned into suspicion. Suspicion turned into anger. But anger has limits when it has nowhere to land, especially in a place where silence is enforced. Years later, a retired deputy admitted something chilling. On the night the final body was recovered, he was pulled aside by a local man he recognized immediately. The warning was short and clear. "You're standing on history," the man said, "and history doesn't like being dug up." The deputy never returned to that forest. What never appeared in official reports was how quickly the land dispute disappeared. The holding company withdrew its claim within months. Survey records vanished. Contracts were quietly dissolved. The forest returned to its previous hands without explanation, as if the attempt to change ownership had never happened at all. 7 lives had reset the balance. By early winter, snow erased what little evidence remained. Footprints vanished. Shallow graves settled. Trees absorbed the past the way forests always do, slowly, completely, and without judgment. To anyone passing through, the land looked untouched. But those who lived there knew better, because something fundamental had changed. Conversations became shorter. Disputes ended faster. No one tested boundaries anymore. The lesson had been delivered clearly enough that it didn't need repeating. The forest had spoken. In the years following the massacre, the case existed in a strange state of suspension. It was never officially closed, yet it was never actively pursued. Files remained open, but untouched. Evidence logs gathered dust. New sheriffs inherited the paperwork without the context, and most chose not to ask why certain questions had never been followed. Silence had become procedure. One detail continued to trouble investigators who reviewed the case decades later. Several of the victims had been released temporarily before their executions. Soil samples and scuff marks suggested that at least 3 men had been moved, unbound, and made to walk short distances before being killed. That meant something had been said to them, and whatever it was, it mattered. No written record explains what those men were told, but one surviving witness indirectly confirmed it years later. A local store owner recalled seeing 2 of the victims the day before they entered the forest. According to him, they believed the dispute had already been settled. They spoke casually, confidently, as if permission had been granted. It had not. In 1986, a forestry surveyor reviewing archived maps noticed something odd. The disputed land where the men had been working no longer existed on updated records. The boundaries had been redrawn, quietly absorbed into adjacent parcels controlled by long-established families. There was no record of purchase, no transfer date, no explanation. It was as if the land itself had been erased. When questioned, county officials offered no answers. Some claimed the changes were clerical errors. Others said the documents had been lost during office moves. A few admitted privately that pushing further would be unwise. The message was always indirect, but always understood. Some histories were not meant to be corrected. A single handwritten note surfaced in the late 1990s, found among personal effects donated to a local museum. It was unsigned and undated, but referenced the timber matter, and warned that reopening it would wake things better left asleep. No names were mentioned, no threats made. None were needed. Families of the victims eventually stopped seeking answers. Some moved away. Others stayed, learning how to live with absence. Over time, grief hardened into something quieter. Acceptance, perhaps, or resignation. In towns where everyone depends on everyone else, isolation is its own punishment. And no one wanted to be isolated. Former deputies admitted that certain calls had been rerouted the week after the killings. Tips disappeared. Statements were never logged. It wasn't a coordinated cover-up in the traditional sense. It was more subtle. A collective decision to stop looking before more damage was done. Justice was weighed. Stability won. By the early 2000s, the massacre had faded from public memory. New generations grew up unaware that 7 men had once been executed in those woods. The forest reclaimed the sites completely. Trees grew where bodies had lain. Trails shifted. Nature finished what silence had started. Only the unease remained. Locals still avoid certain logging roads. Hunters still turn back when fog settles too quickly. Old men still change the subject when October comes around. Not out of fear of ghosts, but out of respect for something far more real. Consequences. Because the lesson of 1972 was never about violence. It was about boundaries. About what happens when pressure builds long enough in places where law is distant and tradition is absolute. The killings were not a breakdown of order. They were enforcement. By 1974, the Oregon Timber Massacre was quietly labeled unsolved due to lack of evidence. The wording appeared neutral, procedural, and final. Yet behind that phrase was an unspoken agreement between agencies that reopening the case would destabilize more than it would resolve. Justice, in the traditional sense, had been deliberately set aside. Internal memos from the period reveal hesitation at every level. State investigators questioned jurisdiction. Federal agencies cited insufficient interstate evidence. County officials worried about retaliation, unrest, and economic collapse. Each institution found a reason not to proceed, and together those reasons formed an invisible wall no one attempted to climb. What made the case impossible to revive was not the absence of clues, but the absence of cooperation. Everyone who might have known something also knew what silence had already achieved. The land remained settled. The disputes ended. No further blood was spilled. In the eyes of the community, the outcome had been effective. That effectiveness carried a cost no report could measure. The families of the 7 men lived with unanswered questions for the rest of their lives. Birthdays passed without fathers. Wives aged into widows without explanations. Grief became something private, spoken only behind closed doors, never allowed where it might cause trouble. In later years, sociologists studying rural violence pointed to this case as an example of community-enforced resolution, a situation where law exists, but tradition operates faster and more decisively. The massacre was not chaos spilling over. It was structure asserting itself when pressure exceeded tolerance. Former lawmen admitted decades later that they understood exactly what had happened, not who pulled each trigger, but why it happened and why it would never be addressed. One retired sheriff summarized it simply: if we'd pushed harder, someone else would have died. No one argued with him. Today, the forests of southern Oregon show no sign of what occurred there in 1972. Trees stand tall where bodies once lay. Logging roads have shifted or vanished entirely. New crews work land they know nothing about, guided by GPS instead of memory, unaware of the rules once written in blood. Yet the legacy remains, not as fear, but as restraint. Disputes end earlier now. Warnings are taken seriously. Boundaries, even unofficial ones, are respected. The massacre did not become a legend because legends invite repetition. It became a lesson, quietly passed down, carefully unspoken. The Oregon Timber Massacre has no heroes, only men who believed they were enforcing order, and men who believed they had the right to be there. When those beliefs collided in a place without oversight, the result was inevitable. Violence did not solve the problem, it finalized it. And that is the most unsettling truth of all. Sometimes the absence of justice does not mean failure. Sometimes it means a different system has already decided the outcome. A system that does not write reports, hold trials, or offer appeals-only consequences. If this story made you question where the line truly lies between law, justice, and survival, leave a like to support the channel. Subscribe for more true stories where history refuses to stay buried, and where silence often tells us more than any verdict ever could. Because some massacres are remembered for what happened. Others are remembered for why no one ever tried to stop it from happening again.